Okay, everybody, I am so excited because we're going to start charcoal. And charcoal is one of those media that I never liked. And over time, I started to understand how it worked. And one of the problems was I had always enjoyed the control of a regular graphite pencil, and charcoal does different stuff. You can use it like a regular pencil, but that's really not where its value is, so to speak. But before we get into that, I did want to show you, and I've got it down here. So I worked a little bit more on my drawing from last week, and you can see here, it's a little bit light in this light, I think. You can, oh, there we go. You can see here how adding a bit more detail and some more of those bricks and such in, and still trying to kind of keep that feeling from the notan of the dark and light. There we go. That's a little bit better. And the feeling that, whoops, of that little person having walked through and your eye being pulled through. So this is what happens to us is that as you know, as we have this short amount of time to draw in, and then we're trying to, then we can work on something later. Often our results later are much more developed and much more thoughtful than what we were able to do during the class time. And because of that, I want to start off today with a charcoal, with a kind of an exercise that's sort of like that audition thing that we did earlier in the summer with the robin, where we were taking an idea all the way through, but not necessarily having to worry a lot about the detail. And I've got a very specific way that we're going to try that today. It's also getting back a little bit to some of that abstraction that we talked about last summer. So let me get started. Okay, everybody, welcome back to another summer of drawing, and we're on class number 8. And this is continuing the theme of home. And this week, we're going to be talking about the move. And I thought it would be very interesting to, deal with for charcoal, an image that we could work with that had some definite darks and lights, but that we would have to crop in some way to really kind of get to the essence of what the theme was about, what the concept was about. So the interpretation, of course, is moving in or out of a home and packing belongings, the chaos, leaving the old and settling into a new life. But I particularly liked this image because of the contrast, the dark and the light. And that is something for charcoal, which is really useful. With pencil, with graphite, you can deal with a lot of, sort of small shades, small areas. With charcoal, I find when you have nice big areas of value and contrast, that can be extremely helpful. So when you're working with charcoal on lighter white paper, and of course, we're going to go through all of these steps over and over, so don't worry, but this is just sort of the way to go about it. Just like with notan, you look for those value shapes, you get some charcoal down in the darker areas. You end up not really worrying so much about what's going on in the lights, because you'll end up with extra charcoal on your blending materials or even your fingers or whatever to sort of start adding the light stuff in. But what'll happen is the charcoal will get all over the place. So you'll have to erase and keep your lights clean all the way through. You'll check your values against each other, what's light, what's dark. Do a lot more erasing, add in more charcoal, do more erasing, refine your drawing at some point, and then repeat your process until your conclusion. Because what happens is this: as you're drawing, the charcoal smears around a bit, the values become lighter than you thought. When you put down more darks, you have to sort of blend those into what you already have going on. And you have to decide with every new bit of charcoal you put down, is this lighter than or darker than the area next to it? So relative values is something you're going to hear me talking about all the way through the class today. And we're going to use sort of as our inspiration Maurice Wade. And if any of you who took the abstraction classes last year, the couple that we did, I used Maurice Wade, a British painter, as an example of taking a scene and abstracting it, not to the point that we couldn't tell what was going on, but taking away the detail that really kind of gets in the way of the story. And I've always really loved Maurice Wade's design and his sort of very clean aspect. And I thought that would be an interesting way to approach this woman in this scene today, because I don't want it to be about drawing her, but more about drawing the scene as a whole. and getting used to using charcoal. So just to give you some examples, I found these these actual sketches that Maurice Wade had done. And I thought this was really instructive to see how he kind of went about really simplifying those forms, making that kind of geometric look that he really liked. You can see that as he even did the sketches around the bend, for example, on the canal, that he's subdivided it into harder lines, harder forms. And that's something that will be very useful for us to try today. He also, though, was very capable of drawing, as you can see on the lower right there, something pretty detailed. This was probably something he was going to do at a large scale. So he made all kinds of notes for himself around the edge about what the details looked like. But really, he's more known for the type of work, the paintings, the paintings that would come from something like the sketch up on the left, where he saw these overall forms and decided to break it down to the essence, leave out details. And in this particular case, I really liked the one on the left because it showed how he was already thinking about how objects in the background had to be lighter, paler, less detailed, and the ones up front had to be darker. And he was also isolating the things that were important to him. In other words, all of these chimneys and the angles of the roofs. On the right, I wanted to show this to you because he did a grid over his sketch and then used that to transfer the drawing onto his canvas. And that's something I like using a lot. So many artists do. And it's fun to kind of see, something in process like this. But once again, I'm sure there was more stuff lying around in this scene than what he shows here, but he just boiled it down to the essence. And that's what we're going to do as well. Oh, I don't know why I've got just her in the corner. Let's move on. There we go. That's what I wanted. So the tools we're going to be using today are charcoal pencils, kneaded rubber erasers, regular erasers, and blending stumps or other types of blending tools. Now, charcoal comes in other forms, and you'll often see people using either block charcoal, especially if they're using working large, or vine charcoal. Both of those are even messier to work with because they don't come, with the encasement of of a pencil. And then another thing people are using more frequently now is charcoal powder that you either can tip out onto your paper or you can dip a brush in and use it to get really soft transitions. But I am not introducing that aspect to you right now because you know how I feel about over softening using blending rather than using the tools to sort of get you there. We'll be doing a ton of blending today, but I think it's really a little more important to also be able to work in hatching or anything else you want to do and not get overly caught up in this idea of everything having to be soft and blended, which I think takes away a lot of character. So what I did was I cropped for you basically what I thought was an interesting approach to the scene by just getting right into the figure, what she's doing. I felt it still told the story, even though the more the further back shot that I showed you initially was kind of interesting because of all the dark boxes. This still leaves enough dark boxes in for us to use. And we have a complete range of values here from the lightest light to the darkest dark, which gives us a lot of scope to work with. So with charcoal, this is the way I tend to go. I start with a plan. It could be a notan, it could be a sketch. I just want to work out the values. I want to have some idea where I'm going. In part, it's because charcoal is very difficult to erase. If you have too much of it down and you've been sketching away, like you might with a pencil, you might find it very difficult to lift it off again. Now, I do use an eraser as part of the process, but I try to be a little bit more controlled. So I start sketching very lightly in pencil or charcoal to get my proportions and objects in place, and often just in pencil for that first go through. So much easier to erase. The preliminary layers of charcoal can be then used to establish some areas of relative values against which you can judge smaller parts of the drawing. So relative value is really just a practice of looking at an area you're working on and saying, is this darker than or lighter than the area around it? And what you end up doing is constantly looking around your drawing and going, wait a minute, okay, the back of her legs are actually darker than the box behind, which is lighter than the cupboards behind. And what about the back wall there? versus the back of her shirt. Those values are actually kind of similar when you squint. So maybe there's an opportunity to let some blending go on there. And so you start to look in terms of what is light, what is dark, and then what are those middle values? What is lighter and darker than something else? So blending areas is a quick way to get the large value shapes down and fill in the paper texture. Charcoal, you tend to work on paper that's a little bit more rough. The surface texture picks up the charcoal dust, but if you want a very blended area, you need to get that dust down into the dips in the paper as well. So blending is useful for that. But it does typically lighten the value of an area. So you have to come back in with some darks again. And then, of course, there's this entire balancing out of relative values. So drawing large shapes and then breaking them down into smaller shapes is a really useful way to go about charcoal rather than getting into the detail. It's one of the reasons that we're not going to try to draw her face, eyes and nose and all of that. And really the figure itself is going to remain very simple along with all of the other shapes that we draw, because it's just like the way we talked about complex textures on top of things, complex patterns. We really want to get convincing form, a convincing feeling of space in this situation, and not worry about her face or hair and all of the rest of that. So once again, I'm going to say try not to rely on blending overall when you're doing charcoal, although we'll be using a lot of it today. Instead, use the hard and soft charcoal leads, hatching, lively drawing, and erasing to add interest. Next week, what we're going to do is something that's more loose than what we're doing today. Today, I want to start off just working on values using this reference. So observation, what needs to be in the scene? It's pretty simple on this one. Some boxes, the woman, the feeling of interior space, and keeping that feeling of light direction. You see, when you look at the larger picture that I took this from, that light direction is really important to, getting that feeling of the dark, the light, all coming in from one angle. So we're going to want to keep everything on her head, the window, even the top of the flap of the box. We're going to want to keep that as clean as we can. So a few things when drawing any drawing or painting medium that's difficult to erase or cover up mistakes, planning is recommended. So, thumbnails to work out the composition and note potential problems. Notan to add in your darks. Is there a good balance? And what we're going to do today is we're going to do the notan, and then we're going to go right into a drawing, but we're going to go about it with this idea that we're going to approach it in the Maurice Wade sort of manner, so that we can get it done in an hour and also get a chance to figure out how do you make things lighter and darker using charcoal. So this is where we're going to start off today, just as we normally do, just so you can get a chance to have a look at this image and figure out what's going on. Just take a couple of minutes here, about 3 minutes, do a really, really small sketch, just looking at the light and dark areas. I find I do have to draw just a little bit, what's going on in order to see what's happening. But it is such a really good place to start. And I find that, if you're sitting down and doing a charcoal drawing sort of live, a figure drawing class, you can't really go through all of this. But even then, sometimes it's good to sort of look at the model and go, okay, where are the darks and the lights? How is that actually going to work? So I'll give you a second here to do this. I'll turn my other computer off. All right, just about another minute for this. I know you might have not had a lot of time to worry about it, but there are so many steps I want to pull us through today that I'm anxious to get started. And I know that you understand the point of the notan, and so I'm gonna pull us on in just a few seconds here. Plus, I think it's good to keep the notan simple. Keep it short. All right, let's move on to the next step. So the first thing that we're going to do today is just start off drawing the basics of this scene using pencil. I would you can start with a hard charcoal pencil if you want to, but I'd really recommend using graphite because you're going to be able to erase it much more easily. What I did in this particular case, and I would suggest the same thing, I'll move on in a minute to showing my sketch smaller and yours larger. You'll notice I used a lot of very straight lines. Even if I was drawing curving things, I went around the edges using these straight lines. I'm thinking about Maurice Wade and his sort of very geometric approach, but also it's much easier, no matter what you're drawing, to work out how the edges are going to work by using straight lines going around the edge, and then you can always soften them later. So let me just make that reference picture larger for you so you can work on this. So this is going to take you a few minutes to do. I want to definitely give you some time on this because this part right here is, it's a little difficult. This figure, she's leaning over. Don't worry if your figure is not looking all that, perfect in terms of the figure drawing part. But it's a good time to start going, okay, where does her chin end in relation to the shoulder? Um, she's leaning over. Is her nose way out in front of her hand? Is her elbow higher than or lower than her hand? Um, all of these sorts of things that we've talked about when we've been talking about vases and apples and that kind of thing. Using your pencil, holding it up to the image and checking those angles to seeing if they're about in the right place. Now, I didn't go crazy myself figuring out those angles. I tried to do this relatively quickly, but even relatively quickly, when you're drawing a person, takes a long time, takes a while to sort of work out. I did a bunch of erasing, added a bunch of extra lines in, but I didn't worry about cleaning this stage up too much because charcoal does go over the top of graphite quite nicely. And that helps out a lot because you can actually move from something relatively rough like this into charcoal without having to do an awful lot of cleanup. Now, one thing you can see right here is that I started with the figure, the stuff that I felt was the most important, and her opening up this box, and where was that windowsill, that window area, and the light going to be. And then what I did, I'm just going to page this on so you can see. Then I added in what I felt, I looked at the reference material and added in, the boxes and things like that I thought were necessary, and then added the border afterwards. So you probably saw in some of those Maurice Wade sketches that when he was sketching, he had done the scene and then he came in obviously afterwards and decided where the edges of that scene were going to be. And that's just an approach that I think is really useful. Many times when I'm sketching, I'll have changed where the borders are going to be. And this business of starting off just in the middle with your main, whatever's most interesting to you or that you think should really be in there, and then kind of building out from the sides. It allows you to move things around if you want to, or suddenly decide, hey, do I really need so much of, whatever the thing is in there? I also left a bunch of stuff out. Actually, one thing I left out I needed to put back in, and that's a flap on the box that's lit in between the two darker shapes, sort of to the lower right. I had to add that in later, which caused me a bit of trouble. But I took away, I liked the candlestick shape and the box on the bureau behind her. I took away the other stuff that was there. I didn't put in the flower that was on the windowsill and whatever I think it might be, a window pane, tilted in, left that out. Didn't put any detail on that door because none of that stuff was really important. I thought the boxes had to be there. I liked the darker shape behind her head. I thought that needed to be there, whatever that is, a table or a door or something. And then I liked the candlestick because it sort of looked out of place, just like it would if you were either packing or unpacking. So we'll just take another minute or so at this stage. And don't panic if you haven't got your drawing all squared away, because you'll have plenty of time in charcoal as we add that stuff in to actually, sort things out if you don't have them quite right, because the graphite will erase. The other thing I thought was kind of interesting about this photo when I looked at it was trying to figure out whether she was packing or unpacking. And I decided it must be unpacking. It just had that sort of feel that she's, looking inside a box that had been sealed up, trying to figure what's in there and is taking things out. But that's the kind of story that can go along with the drawing that you do that makes people, look a little bit more closely for those kinds of clues. What are the clues, for example, that she might be packing something up? you might see, packing material and that sort of thing around, or things in an orderly stack or something like that, waiting to go in a box. And I think that a little bit of ambiguity is just fine. It doesn't really matter, which way it's going. If we call it this drawing the move, it tells you something about what's happening. And then you can look a little bit further to look for clues to find out specifically what is happening. All right, let's move on to our first charcoal stage. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put some charcoal down in the darkest areas. And I use a relatively hard charcoal pencil, but not too hard, not like a 4H or something, like an HB or an H if you've got that. Because the first thing that happens is you're like, oh, this is a super dark medium. And it is a little bit difficult to get an even tone the way that we did in pencil. So just keep in mind, you'll be blending this stuff smoother in the next step. So don't get too worried about this. Let me go ahead and make your picture bigger again. So you can see when you see the smaller version of what I did, that I wasn't worried too much about what's going to be the darkest versus the least dark. What I'm trying to do is actually just get some charcoal dust down on my paper, and it's not all that easy to do. It's you can find that charcoal is a little scratchy. It doesn't give you the coverage that a pencil does. You can tell all the reasons why I had a hard time with charcoal once I got started, because I kept comparing it to this much more fluid, graphic. The graphite, just was much smoother on the paper and everything. But after a while, I started to really enjoy how quickly you could get a sense of atmosphere, or a sense of place, dimension, and depth and everything, because you can build those values in so much faster than you can with graphite. So I just picked a few areas. It's not as if other areas wouldn't be just fine to put graphite down in. For example, I could have added in the candlestick in the box as well. I just sort of kept things a little bit separated. You can kind of see that I put darks down, but I didn't go too crazy yet. I wasn't quite ready to start putting it everywhere. I wanted to kind of, move in slowly. And this is what I would recommend for you as well, because as you're doing this, as you're drawing and putting these shapes down, you're probably also starting to be aware of things you hadn't seen before. And you might be asking yourself, well, if I'm doing this like Maurice Wade, do I include, the hardware on the cabinets? Do I include some of this detail that I see under the flap that's under her stomach? You can kind of see through to other boxes. Do I include that or not? I decided not to, but you can see here at this point on the drawing, I wasn't quite sure. So I sort of hadn't addressed it yet. I wasn't quite sure whether that was something I should do. And so I'm going to move us on to the blending bit, because that's, I think, when things start to come together a little bit more. So this is the first stage of blending in charcoal, where you take that initial area, those dark areas, and you start to blend them with something, either a blending stump or a rag or whatever you want to use. And this is when the mess starts, if it hasn't started already, because now none of your areas are neat anymore. And unlike what we were doing in graphite, you're kind of losing control and the charcoal is taking over. And so the best way to manage that is to not worry about it and to use the messiness of charcoal to your advantage. You see here how I've kind of got, this gray of charcoal kind of rubbed roughly all over the place. I've added in some more charcoal now, a little bit lighter. I went to a lighter, I think I might have used an H or something like that, like lighter charcoal pencil. I'm still being a little bit rough and not too careful. That's in part because I'm trying to get things moving for this particular sketch. Let me go ahead and move it so that you've got your large reference again. But if you see this in the small, you can see already how I'm starting to get a bunch of values in there. So what I tend to do is, if I've got some more charcoal on my rag after I've rubbed the dark areas, I'll see where else do I need, in particular, a light value, because it's very, very difficult to draw light values in charcoal. In pencil, we were doing that stuff, with the beveled end and just regular sketching, where you can go to like a 4H and you get a a color, so to speak, of value that's so light, it's hard for even me to even show it to you, in the camera. With charcoal, almost instantly, you're going to be like right into those midtones and heading dark, no matter what you put down. So that means that the residue that you have, whether it's on your finger, a cotton swab, a rag, a blending stump, whatever it is, that you can use that in other places. Now, the first thing you'll find when you do that, having just received that good news, is that it's then hard to control those light areas. And you can see where I put some down and then I kind of ran out of graphite. And now I've got light areas and darker areas in my lighter areas. I didn't worry about it overly. I knew there would be a chance to sort of even that out later on. And the more you do, the worse you can make it. And so what I did instead was I said, okay, let me go back and add some more darks in, some more graphite, blend that out. I mean, some more charcoal, blend that out. Now I need to start really actually looking at these relative values. What's lighter and what's darker than the thing next to it, and start building that out. It takes a little bit of looking to really do this, to start kind of going, okay, I see that, for example, the countertop and where the candlestick and the box are actually darker than the area that I've already shaded. What am I going to do about that? So I decided I would just postpone worrying about that for now, and I would figure that out later, figure out what to do on that later. I've got this box behind her. I realized I hadn't drawn it exactly accurately, but for the moment, I'm just going to leave it alone. But that is actually lighter than her shorts, and it's lighter than the back of her legs. So as I go forward, adding more charcoal, doing more drawing, doing more blending, I've got to start taking all of that into account. But right now, I'm just kind of starting with the darks and moving towards the midtones. Starting to move towards the midtones in terms of what I'm actually drawing in, sketching in with a charcoal pencil. But I am staying aware of those lighter values and using the residue to put some of the charcoal down in those lighter values. So I'm going to continue to pull us along here. Don't worry if you find that you're kind of at a stage before, because I just sort of want to make sure we get through all of this stuff, and that you sort of see how the process works. So the next part is adding in even more values. So I'm blending as I go and as I feel that I need to. I've decided at this point that I was going to go ahead and make that stuff like the candlestick and the box darker. But when I did, as I added more charcoal, that sort of changed, how the front of those cabinets looked. And now I'm adding in charcoal in other places as well. I'm still still in the HB to 2B kind of range, for the charcoal, except when I want to show a little bit more hatching or some more directional lines. Then I'm using the harder charcoal, but I haven't gone to the really soft stuff yet. I'm saving that for the end, because I still realize, for example, on these boxes that are closer to me, there are a lot of values there that are very close to each other. How am I going to handle that? So let me get your picture larger so you can kind of work on that. It's easier, I think, to see when you look at my drawing smaller, sort of how I was working through that. I'm also looking at one of those other subjects that we talked about a lot last year, and that is how every surface has a gradation to it. So if we look at the sides of the boxes that are closer to us, there's a lighter area, a lighter corner, and then there's a darker corner. She's opening up the flap of the box. As the side of the box goes down, it gets darker as it gets further away from the light. And so, right now you might not be pulling in all of those details, but as you notice them, you might want to do kind of what I did, like the bottom of that box I just talked about, where you add some darks in. Now that's where that flap should be. And so if you're trying to do what I am doing, make a note that there should be a pale flap right there, because I didn't really key into the fact I needed to have that until another stage or two. And once I tried to erase out all of these darks I put in, it got a little bit difficult. So here's one of those, take my advice, put that flap in now. but I liked this. I started to really, at this point, I'm starting to feel like, okay, I see the kind of Maurice Wade-ish way to approach it. Every time I tried to, do my normal thing, which is to add more detail in, I was able to pull back a little bit because the charcoal actually wouldn't really, it didn't really, it wasn't conducive to adding those details in at this point. Otherwise, I'd get into a situation where I had one really well developed face and everything else these big flat shapes. And so with charcoal, it's really useful to continue to work in these large, flatter areas, even if you're adding in gradations, while you're trying to sort out the lights and the darks and the feeling of depth. Because the more you work on it, the softer everything becomes, the more you keep going back to these midtones, the more you keep having to add dark and separate it out, the messier things get. And it is this kind of, push me, pull you of what's going on. Also, at this point, when I'm getting back to the point of going, oh, okay, I do need to add some really dark darks. Like there are some things I'm missing here, and I need to start working those back in. For example, below the flap and at the front of her legs, that's a really dark area. And I'm starting to realize, oh gosh, the boxes on the right, they have some areas on them which should be much darker, almost as dark as that area on, in front of her legs. And I need to start working those in as well, so that the other values that I put beside them have the correct degree from a relative value point of view, which one's lighter than which one, which one's darker than which. So that everything kind of falls in place and has a hierarchy from light to dark that makes visual sense. So I think that when you're working on something, whether it's drawing or painting or charcoal, this business of training yourself as you're drawing, you can do it as you're drawing rather than before if you want to, because I this is how I tend to do it. You kind of go, you assess what's going on. Okay, this area of the front of the cabinets is darker than the box. It's darker than her shorts. It's darker than her shirt, but it's lighter than the countertop. So I have not done that. I have not made it like that. Am I going to make that change as I go along? Then I can look at things like, hey, that far wall has to be darker than the side of the window where the light's coming in. So somehow, as I get more charcoal on my, I was using a rag actually, on the end of my rag, I need to continue to rub a little bit more back there to keep that going. So let me move on to the next stage. So now I blend again. You can see immediately how that softens up all those darks, but it adds a sense of unity. And now I'm really starting to get a feeling of some forms going. It's easier, like I said, to continue to add more color, I call it color, with the charcoal that's on your blending stump or on your rag or whatever, at this point. And actually, sometimes I end up sort of pulling my finger, through the drawing to sort of unite areas that where it might be useful to, because I know at the end I'm going to neaten all of this up. I don't have to worry about being neat now. That's where the erasers come in. That's where at the end I'll come in with the darks and the very careful charcoal pencil work. I don't have to worry about that now. Let me give you back your larger image there. So once again, we're starting to get that feeling of lights and darks and relative shapes. I darkened up my countertop a little bit so that there was some differentiation. I couldn't help it, but on the candlestick, I put a little detail and some darks on the right, even though we're supposed to be like Maurice Wade. Unfortunately, my natural inclination towards detail sort of reared its ugly head. But I also started noticing something else, that okay, I've got some things too dark. For example, I've got that flap that she's lifting up. I've made that too dark. Relatively, it should be lighter than the side of the box, and about the same value as her arm. And I've done too much shading there. So, this is the sort of thing as you go along. Don't expect that you're going to hit the right value in the right place throughout the thing, unless you've already made a plan like this and now you're working on the larger drawing and you've already kind of worked your way through these problems and these issues. The other thing that was difficult for me was, at this point, I had started to try to put more stuff on her face. I'm a portrait artist, I can't help it. And then I had to erase it, which wasn't easy at all. And then I had to sort of add some color back in to sort of, obfuscate for me my tendency to want to have to put in an ear and the dark part of the hair and the bun and this, that, and the other. So purposefully, I kind of made it into a sort of like more like a generic form that isn't even really all that head-like, just to stop myself because I was very keen on sticking to this sort of Maurice Wade look. All right, we're going to move on to the next bit. Now it's time for some erasing. So if things have really gone, haywire and you've got, too much stuff going on, you can see here I added my flap back in and it was difficult to do on top of the erasing. But it is time at this point to start going, okay, I need to keep those areas of light clear. Those, without having this contrast of the light and dark, I lose the beauty of charcoal to just sort of this big smudgy mess. I had to be able to, at some point, make everything crisp again. And one of the ways to do that is starting by adding in getting those highlights back, cleaning up those edges, and likewise, pushing those darks even darker where I think I might need to. So this is a continual process. I mean, this goes on during the course of your drawing over and over again. It's not just one thing that happens. Also, you can make decisions at this time about other stuff that's happened, either happy or unhappy accidents. So in my case, I decided, the background wall of this particular scene is very even. It's an even coat of paint with just a little bit of shading on it. Because I've been dabbing my finger in with charcoal on in kind of an uneven manner, I've got some texture going on back there. And you know what? I like it. I'm not going to try to get rid of it. Um, when it first started happening, I was thinking to myself, this might be a problem. Maybe I've got to do something about it. And then I thought as I went on, you know what? I don't have to do anything about it. It looks just fine. I'm going to leave that alone. But I definitely wanted to have, for example, the area around the window well, that needed to be, very, in my opinion, very clean and open. I wanted those front reflections on her shirt to be very clean and open as well. All right, I am going to move on to the next step here. Okay, so this is basically, very close to where I ended up with the drawing overall. Definitely getting closer to the finish here. Once again, just playing these lights and darks back and forth, adding a little bit of detail where I wanted to, moving. I made the top of that flap a little bit lighter. Darken the side of the box, which meant that the box that was closest to me then had to get even darker. So I had to keep changing those relative values until I got something that I felt that worked. Let me make your reference larger again. So this whole process of, put down more charcoal, either in lighter areas or using a bit of hatching. You can see that I haven't overly blended some of those areas on the side of the box because I'm trying to keep that kind of corrugated feel and also not have everything exactly the same texture. If I were to do this as a larger image than what I'm working on right here, I would really be trying to come up with ways to make sure that I did have, a different feeling of different textures going on, from one area to the next. So I'll just let you work on this for a couple more minutes, and then we'll get to the final stage. And I have one more exercise for you to do before we're finished. So those of you who are thinking that we're going to be taking this all the way up to 5 minutes until, I'm sorry, we're not going to do that. So just sort of move this along, to the extent that you can. And this is also a really good time to look back at your notan and think to yourself, am I getting the flow of lights and darks that I want? And one way to really assess that, and one thing I love about charcoal for this reason, it's sort of easy to see whether you have kind of, your darks don't all have to be connected, and darks meaning like everything up to the mid values. Your darks don't have to be connected literally, but it's nice if there's a flow. And likewise, it's nice if your lighter areas also have a flow, that there's something kind of leading you through, even if it's not actually connected. And this is the sort of thing that's helpful when I talk about lost edges. For example, we mentioned how the back of her shirt and the back wall, were kind of the same value. That's a really good place just to sort of let in some portion, and I did it the lower back of her shirt, just be that same value. It kind of gives a sort of a feeling that the form is turning a little bit. Um, how you pick and choose to do that, how much you choose to show as light and dark, how you choose to sort of link these areas up is completely up to you. But it is a feeling at this point of going, do I need to add a little bit more linking in? Do I need to tighten anything up? So my last stage, I'm just going to show this to you a little bit larger. Um, Actually, this is the second to last stage. Sorry. I'm continuing to do that. I'm going back in. I'm looking for those lights. I'm trying to get the form back again. And I'm going to just push to the very last. So here is the very last stage. I basically, you saw I just kept adding more. Every time you add more charcoal in, you lose the smoothness. It goes rough again. You have to go back and pick out, what are you going to do with your with the shading? Are you going to leave something light or dark? How are you going to work it? How much texture do you want to add in? Now, it's my inclination, unfortunately, at this point, like even if I were trying the Maurice Wade thing, is to start breaking down into even smaller sections and getting those values in. And that really isn't sort of, if we're thinking of how he approached his drawings and paintings, it isn't really how he went through the process. But what you see is how in a very short amount of time, we have this feeling of depth and a feeling of form. And even though we haven't got details on the faces and on the clothing and all of that sort of thing, what we do have is a sense of something happening. There's a sense of place. There's a sense of something going on. And that any painting or drawing that went forward using this as the basis would have would already have this really great sense of atmosphere built in. And charcoal helps us know that. It kind of helps us give, clues to, where our texture might be if we did a larger drawing, and also helps us figure out, okay, are there places where stuff, should be darker, should be lighter, what kind of decisions to make. For example, I had made those boards in the dark areas that are behind her face a lot darker, and then I felt it didn't really give the sense of depth. So even though in the photo that's a relatively dark area where you see that door or whatever it is leaning up against the wall, I decided to subdue that for this, but make sure those other boxes that are closer to us are darker. So I'll give you just a second more here, and we're going to do another. Let's see. Okay, so this is where I got to as my final, all right? And I'm just showing you a small right here because I want you to continue working away as you are. And you can see now how I've really, I went back in and I said, okay, I do need some darks back there, but I need to do them a little bit differently than I had been working before. I need to, get the depth into those, the darker charcoal areas, and likewise the boxes. I really need to, this is the time to go in and clean up all my edges, get my super darks in there, make sure my highlights are properly lit. I did a little fiddling around with that box that's behind her, et cetera, et cetera. And the way that I did the darkest areas was I went back in with a 4B or a 6B, and I actually waited until about this stage to do that. Only in the last, couple of stages have I used 4B and 6B. When you put down that charcoal, it's really dark. And then I took my blending tool and sort of blended it into what was already existing. So I didn't go all the way over the dark areas I already had. I just used the darkest charcoal for the kind of the core shadow, and then blended, left it alone, didn't blend all over it, but just blended kind of the edge into the next darkest areas so that my darks still got a big punch. So I'll give you about a minute at this point to finish up, and then we'll do this last exercise, which I think is a really valuable one when you're dealing with, sort of a cluttered picture like this one, and you're trying to kind of boil it down to the essence like we are. Now, next week when we're working, we'll be doing, we'll start out, we'll use these same steps. We'll be going through these same steps, but we're going to be trying to add in, rather than a kind of a tight and sort of a formal layout that's pretty geometric and gets rid of details, we're going to be looking at how you use all of these same techniques to add in details where you want and add in movement and a little bit of life. This is actually very this is a very almost a still life of a person in a sense. You know, it's capturing a moment where she is actually still, not really moving all that much. And next week we'll be talking about how you use charcoal to kind of get a little bit more of that action in there. Okay, let's wrap this up. And I'm just going to show you, these are all the steps we've just gone through, from the notan, starting the sketch, and then getting your sketch organized in graphite, then adding in darks, doing some blending, adding in some more charcoal and doing some blending, adding in some more charcoal and doing some erasing, and then flipping back between adding more charcoal, doing more erasing, adding more charcoal, blending, doing more erasing, until you finally get to the point where you're like, okay, I think this satisfies what I was after. And so for me, this image, I felt, kind of kept that slightly geometric look that we were after, didn't get bogged down in the details for today, and really does work the way that I had intended it to from looking back at the notan. So that's kind of the essence. This is sort of the quick view of how this particular application of using a charcoal technique works. And now I want to do one more exercise before we stop today. And this is just to go back and have a look at that business of how Maurice Wade did his artwork and sort of boiled things down. And what I want you to do is, using the sketch that you've already done, pretend you were starting over again, using your sketch as the starting point to sort of get a more boiled down, a more getting down to the essence of the scene version, as if you were going to start this whole process again, but using your artwork as the primary reference. Now, I've left a little version of what we were looking at up in the corner, just so you can, get that idea again. But even if you felt that your artwork wasn't exactly accurate, still use that as a jumping off point, because this is how artists go about doing something that still has, maybe a foot in realism, but starts to maybe the perspective isn't right, and maybe your person is looking a little bit more, warped or whatever than you had originally wanted. Maybe the boxes aren't piled up exactly right, or whatever it happens to be. But how much artwork do we admire all the time in museums where exactly those kinds of exaggerations and changes were made? Because an artist started taking the steps to move away from the photographic reality towards their own vision, and using their own sketches to help get them there, rather than just relying on a photograph or even on real life. So just take a couple of minutes to do this. This is just an exercise in using your own work as a jumping off point. And before we move on to the final bit of info. Okay, Joe has asked an excellent question about getting light values in charcoal, and it is almost impossible to do with with an actual pencil. Almost always you'll see that artists who've got light values, they did it by a number of ways. They either did, just as Joe suggested, just going back to graphite. The only reason that sometimes that isn't is useful, there's a reflective quality to graphite, whereas charcoal is a little bit denser, and so you can get a little bit of a sheen going on. But it's perfectly okay if you want, a more even form. Many artists combine graphite and charcoal in one drawing. There's no rule that says you can't. I tend to do a lot of, once I've got a couple of what I called seasoned drawing stumps, I might even make a little bit of patch of charcoal on a piece of paper over to the side, and then get some of that charcoal on the drawing stump, or cotton wool or whatever I'm using, and then kind of draw in this flakier charcoal using the drawing stump in the lighter area. But what I tend to do the most is this business of just as I'm drawing and putting down the darker charcoal, and I get some charcoal on my drawing stump, looking around to see where I need some light value, and just using the drawing stump by itself, the blending stump by itself, or the Q-tip or whatever it is by itself, um, even though it doesn't have a lot on it, because I don't want to get too dark too fast, I go ahead and just use that as the tool to get the lighter stuff down. I think that most charcoal drawing sets really, if you have, you might have like one like it's an H or maybe even a 2H, but even those are very dark. The first stages that I did on this drawing, I used, an H or an HB, which we tend to think from graphite is going to be relatively light. And it was already heading me into a very, very dark values. So this is just something that comes with practice. And I think one of the things that people find overwhelming when they first start with charcoal is how very dark it is and how very difficult it is to control the values. And so using things like blending stumps or just a rag over the end of your finger to get those lighter values, it takes away the problem of feeling that you have to draw them in like you would with graphite normally. Okay, folks, let's wrap this up and just move to the last bit on here. All right. So talking about concept again, once again, telling your own story. In this case, I think all of us have moved probably multiple times during the course of our life. So drawing something about moving certainly is a story that I can talk about. You have years of experience, as I've said before, all the subject matter and ideas to pull from. So even though we're still talking about the subject, the theme of home, we've already looked at 8 different ways to explore how you can come up with drawings that relate, some very closely, some a little bit more vaguely, to the idea of home. And then what really needs to go into the drawing? So I used the Maurice Wade and the kind of the abstraction discussion today to help us eliminate things that really don't belong there. I think there's a tendency with charcoal as with pencil, now that these drawing forms are becoming popular again, to copy too much stuff that is in the photograph. And I want to encourage you all the time to step away from that, either by doing these preliminary drawings where you kind of test out how you're going to do it, what is actually needed, and then using your own drawing as part of the reference, your drawing, your notan, your sketches, or whatever, to do a more finished work where you can consciously eliminate things that don't need to be there. And that, of course, I'm going to continue to harp on the fact that I don't want you to skip the preliminaries, no matter how rough your sketches are. Do something, do something up front to help you get, into the drawing. So the technique for charcoal definitely calls for looking at those value shapes, squinting. And what I always do is I start off by getting the charcoal down in the darkest areas first. I blend that in, move it around the drawing. I'm going to have to erase. I'm going to have to add more charcoal, rinse and repeat, more blending, working towards the lights, but trying to keep those lights clean, if at all possible. Very difficult. You saw how when I tried to add the box flap back in, I mean, I erased like crazy. I could not get those lines to go away. So, and at that point you just go, oh, that's part of the drawing. So next week, we're going to try a more free approach to charcoal, building on these same steps. But you might want to try this exercise again when you get the PDF today. Just go through it again, because it's not so much about the drawing. Doesn't matter if your person looks like a person or not. What matters more is that you're working on the relative values and you're trying to get a feeling for what charcoal does, because it's really more a way to deposit charcoal dust on your paper than it is a way to, actually, when you're using this method, but then it is a way to sort of draw the way that we have been when we've been worrying about cross hatching and all of that other stuff. We can and will be pulling all of that stuff in, but for the moment, let's just worry about these big value shapes. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, everybody, I hope that wasn't too overwhelming of a start to charcoal. And don't worry if you're kind of breaking out in a sweat over this. We'll be doing charcoal more often through the course of the summer. But I think this sort of approach in and not worrying too much about details and definitely keeping an eye on relative values is important no matter what drawing medium you're working with. So thank you very much. It was wonderful to have you in the studio today, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again next week for another Summer of Drawing class number 9.